The morning of June 14, 1645, a grey mist lies thick over the open fields of Northamptonshire. The air is damp and heavy, clinging to buff coats and breastplates. Beyond the ridge, a trumpet sounds. Its note quivers through the fog like a solemn warning. On the slopes near the small village of Naseby, the soldiers of Parliament awaken. They are men of the new model army, weary from prayer, yet steady in purpose. Throughout the night, they have knelt upon the wet grass, murmuring psalms beneath their breath, believing the coming battle to be a holy trial. Their commanders, Sir Thomas Fairfax and Lieutenant General Oliver Cromwell, ride slowly along the lines, their faces pale and calm in the half-light. For months, England has stood divided by fear and pride. Families have split, neighbours have taken arms against each other, and the fields that once bore harvest now bear the weight of war. This dawn, all those years of anger and division will be tested by fire. Across the valley stands the Royalist army, loyal to King Charles III. The king himself is not present. His standard is carried beneath the command of his nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Rupert, proud and experienced, sits astride his horse and studies the parliamentarian line through the drifting fog. He has fought on battlefields across Europe and has earned a reputation for fearless charges and daring speed. Yet before him today stands a different kind of enemy, a disciplined, unified army that fights not for pay or plunder, but for what it believes to be the will of God. The numbers are nearly equal, around 12,000 men on each side, but the spirit of the armies could not be more different. Rupert's men are brave yet tired, loyal yet worn down by months of retreat. Their powder is scarce, and their faith in victory uncertain. Fairfax's soldiers are fresh, drilled and bound together by common purpose. Their scarlet coats glisten with dew, and their banners, painted with scripture, flutter in the morning wind. Each regiment believes it fights for the very soul of England. The sun begins to rise, the mist thins and turns to silver in the light. A wind from the west sweeps across the open ground, stirring the tall grass and the long shafts of the pikes. Drums begin to beat in slow rhythm. Artillery is dragged forward, the wheels creaking as gunners position their sakers and demi-culverins on the ridge. Parliament's guns fire first, each discharge booming like a blow against the heart of the earth. White smoke bursts from the muzzles and rolls toward the Royalist line. The smell of saltpetre and damp grass fills the air. Rupert answers with his own artillery. The roar of his cannon crashes back across the valley. Between the two lines, smoke drifts and curls until the valley becomes a ghostly sea of white. Through that haze, the soldiers advance. On Parliament's right flank, Cromwell leads his cavalry forward. 5 regiments of horse, more than 2,000 riders, move with precision. Their formation holds firm, each troop keeping equal distance, each rider gripping sword and pistol. Cromwell rides among them in iron armour, his eyes fixed on the far ridge where Rupert's cavalry wait. He knows that victory will depend on discipline rather than fury. His men, called the Ironsides, are soldiers of conscience as much as skill. Rupert lowers his sword. His cavalry surge down the slope at full gallop. The thunder of hooves shakes the ground, and the cry of "For God and the King" rises above the drums. The impact is immense, yet Cromwell's line holds. His troopers fire in controlled volleys, then close with cold steel. Swords flash, horses rear. The hillside vanishes in dust and smoke. At the centre, the infantry advance through the smoke. Musketeers fire by rank, the volleys merging into one long rolling crackle. Between them stand the pike blocks, long shafts thrust forward in dense formation. The sound of battle becomes a living storm of fire, smoke, and shouting. Men push against each other with the pikes, struggling shoulder to shoulder. The cries of "God with us" and "For the King" echo together until they blend into one roar of rage and faith. To the west, the Royalist flank begins to break. Cromwell sees it. He gathers his reserve squadrons and wheels them across the field in perfect order. Trumpets sound the advance. His cavalry sweep in a great curve that crashes against the exposed side of the Royalist army. Rupert's horse, still scattered after their first charge, are too far to return. The Royalist line collapses under the pressure. Within 2 hours, the field is lost. Fairfax pushes forward, his infantry pressing the last resistance. Cromwell's horse encircle the enemy. Flags fall, muskets are thrown down. The King's standard is captured, and the Royalist artillery silenced. The valley is filled with smoke, the air thick with the smell of powder and blood. When the smoke clears, the field of Naseby lies covered with the fallen. The warhorse lies beside the foot soldier, pike shafts broken and banners trampled into the mud. The cries of the wounded mingle with the wind. The Battle of Naseby is over. The King's army is destroyed, and with it the last hope of royal victory. Yet from this ruin will rise something entirely new, a nation forced to question its crown, its church, and the meaning of authority itself. Long before the thunder of muskets at Naseby, the Kingdom of England had already begun to tear itself apart. The causes of this conflict reached deep into the reign of King Charles III, a monarch devoted to his divine right, yet estranged from the will of his people. In 1625, Charles ascended the throne with a vision of sacred kingship. He believed his authority flowed directly from God, not from Parliament or the common consent of his subjects. At first, few challenged this idea. England had long been ruled by kings who claimed divine sanction. But Charles's stubborn nature and his deep faith in ceremony and order soon clashed with a generation that valued scripture, conscience, and parliamentary voice above royal decree. The heart of the conflict was money and faith. War with Spain and France drained the treasury. Parliament refused to fund the king's ambitions without oversight, and Charles, affronted, dissolved it. For 11 long years, from 1629 to 1640, he ruled without it. This period became known as the personal rule. The king raised funds through ancient taxes revived by royal prerogative, ship money, forced loans, and fines for old laws long forgotten. To his subjects, it seemed tyranny disguised as tradition. In religion, the divide grew wider still. Charles favoured the high ceremonial worship of the Church of England. His chosen Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, enforced strict order in worship and restored altars and vestments that reminded many of the hated Catholic faith. Puritans, who sought simplicity and purity in devotion, saw these changes as a betrayal. Sermons across England began to bristle with resentment. A shadow of fear spread that the old enemy, Rome, was creeping back beneath the king's crown. When Charles attempted to extend his religious policy to Scotland, the storm broke. The Scots, fiercely protective of their Presbyterian church, refused his new prayer book. Riots erupted in Edinburgh. In 1639, and again in 1640, Charles marched north to subdue them in the Bishops' Wars. But his army, unpaid and unwilling, faltered. Defeated and bankrupt, the king was forced to recall Parliament. The body that assembled in November 1640 would later be called the Long Parliament, and it came armed not with swords, but with vengeance. Many of its members, men like John Pym, believed they were rescuing England from creeping despotism. They demanded the trial of the king's ministers, the abolition of arbitrary courts, and limits on royal taxation. The king, cornered, was forced to concede again and again. The Tower of London filled with his advisers, including Archbishop Laud. Yet every victory of Parliament deepened Charles's resolve. He believed these men were tearing apart the sacred order of the realm. His court whispered of rebellion in disguise, of Puritans who would overthrow both altar and throne. The final spark came from across the sea. In October 1641, Ireland erupted in rebellion. Catholic Irish rose against Protestant settlers, claiming loyalty to the king even as they struck down his representatives. News of massacres and atrocities, exaggerated though they were, swept through England like wildfire. Panic and outrage filled the streets of London. Many blamed Charles, suspecting that he secretly encouraged the Irish to strengthen his cause. By early 1642, distrust had turned to open confrontation. The king's attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in the House of Commons failed. Crowds filled the streets shouting for liberty and Parliament. Fearing for his safety, Charles fled the capital. From that moment, the centre of England's power lay divided. Parliament in Westminster, the King at Oxford. The months that followed were a slow march toward the inevitable. Counties raised militias. Guns were cast. Church bells were melted into cannon. Friends and families chose sides, sometimes not from conviction, but from survival. By summer, both armies were ready to fight. On a fall. August 22nd, 1642. On a windy hill above Nottingham, King Charles I raised the royal standard. Witnesses said the flag snapped and twisted in the storm until the pole itself broke. It was a dark omen, but few yet understood how much blood would follow. In the months that came, England would learn the meaning of civil war, a struggle fought not against a foreign foe, but between brothers, fathers, and sons. The clash between Crown and Parliament was no longer a quarrel of words or principles. It had become a test of endurance, of faith, and of England's very identity. The raising of the royal standard at Nottingham in August 1642 marked the beginning of the First English Civil War. The King's banner fluttered in the storm, a signal to all England that loyalty to the Crown was now a matter of arms. Across the realm, church bells tolled in alarm as counties chose sides. Parliament commanded London and the wealth of the southeast. The King held the loyal shires of the north and west. Between them stretched a country torn in two. Neither side began with a professional army. Both scrambled to organize local militias, train bands, and volunteers. Men who had never stood in formation were suddenly drilled to the beat of drums. Farmers left their ploughs, apprentices their shops, to don buff coats and take up musket or pike. Horses were seized from estates, pistols taken from manor walls. England had become an armed camp. In the early months, both armies were uncertain and uneven. The King's forces, known as the Royalists or Cavaliers, drew strength from the old nobility and the northern gentry. Their cavalry was bold, their cause bound to the person of the King himself. Parliament soldiers, called Roundheads by their enemies for their cropped hair, were commanded by men of experience but limited means. They fought under the banner of law and liberty, convinced that tyranny must be checked by the people's voice. The first great clash came on October 23rd, 1642, at Edgehill in Warwickshire. Neither side had fought such a battle before. The armies faced each other across the rolling fields as the autumn sun rose through the mist. Prince Rupert led the Royalist cavalry, glittering in armour, his horsemen eager for glory. Parliament's army, under the Earl of Essex, formed stiff ranks of pike and musket. When the guns opened, the air filled with the roar of artillery and the smell of burnt powder. Rupert's horse charged like a thunderbolt, scattering Parliament's left flank, yet his men galloped too far in pursuit. On the other side of the field, Parliament's cavalry held firm and counterattacked. The result was chaos and confusion. As darkness fell, neither side could claim victory. Edgehill was a bloody draw, but its lesson was clear. The war would not be swift or simple. Over the next year, England became a patchwork of siege lines, garrisons, and raids. The King established his court at Oxford, turning the ancient university into the heart of his campaign. Parliament fortified London, its workshops turning out pikes, armour, and powder by the ton. Rivers became frontiers, towns became fortresses. In 1643, the Royalists seemed ascendant. Rupert's cavalry swept across the Midlands, taking Bristol and threatening London as itself. Yet even as they advanced, the King's forces were stretched thin. In the west, Sir Ralph Hopton fought for Cornwall and Devon, while in the north the Earl of Newcastle struggled to hold Yorkshire. Parliament answered with regional armies under Sir William Waller or Lord Fairfax, and Oliver Cromwell, each fighting bitterly for control of counties and strongholds. Religion sharpened every wound. Sermons before battle told soldiers they were fighting God's enemies. Parliament called for a day of fasting and humiliation, believing repentance might turn the tide. The king's chaplains urged his soldiers to fight for the church and crown. The war became not only political, but spiritual. By 1644, the balance began to shift. Parliament sought help from Scotland, signing the Solemn League and Covenant. In return for Scottish troops, Parliament promised to reform the English church along Presbyterian lines. That winter, 20,000 Scots crossed the border, their blue banners and psalm-singing ranks a new and powerful force. The decisive battle came in the north at Marston Moor, on July 2, 1644. The Royalists under Prince Rupert and the Marquis of Newcastle faced a combined army of English parliamentarians and Scots under Lord Fairfax and the Earl of Manchester. For hours, cannon fire rolled across the moor. As evening fell, Rupert's cavalry attacked, but Cromwell's disciplined horse met them head-on. The parliamentarian left, known later as the Ironsides, broke Rupert's charge, turned his flank, and swept the field. Marston Moor was a catastrophe for the king. His power in the north collapsed. York surrendered soon after, and Prince Rupert's reputation as an unstoppable commander was broken. Yet the war dragged on. Armies still clashed across the Midlands and the West, leaving behind burnt farms, shattered churches, and villages emptied by plague and famine. The soldiers who survived lived in constant hardship. Muddy camps, meagre rations, disease and cold were as deadly as musket balls. Many began to fight not for pay or plunder, but because they had no other life left to return to. By the end of 1644, Parliament realised it needed a new kind of army, one that could fight anywhere in England, loyal not to a region, but to a cause. The stage was set for the creation of a force that would change the course of the war and the fate of the kingdom itself. By the winter of 1644, Parliament understood that victory would not come through scattered regional armies or cautious generals. The king still held much of the countryside, and his forces, though bloodied, remained determined. The war had dragged on for 2.5 years, draining the nation's strength. If Parliament was to triumph, it needed discipline, organisation, and faith united under one banner. From this necessity came a radical idea. In early 1645, Parliament voted to create a single, centralised fighting force known as the New Model Army. It would be commanded by professionals rather than nobles, paid from the treasury rather than by local taxes, and led by officers chosen for merit rather than birth. The measure was controversial, but the cause demanded it. The Self-Denying Ordinance, passed that spring, required members of Parliament to surrender their military commands. The reorganisation placed the army under new leadership. Sir Thomas Fairfax as Commander-in-Chief, Philip Skippon as Sergeant Major General of the Infantry, and Oliver Cromwell as Lieutenant General of the Horse. The creation of the new model army transformed the war. Recruits were drawn from across the counties, drilled to uniform standards, and bound by a strict code of conduct. They wore the same red coats, carried standardized weapons, and received regular pay. More importantly, they were infused with a shared spirit of purpose. Chaplains preached to the ranks that they were fighting not merely for Parliament, but for the godly reformation of England itself. Training camps echoed with prayer as much as with musket fire. Before battle, regiments gathered for sermons and psalms. Soldiers saw themselves as instruments of divine will, fighting for a righteous cause. The discipline that emerged made them unlike any other force in Europe. Cromwell's cavalry, known as the Full Ironsides, set the standard. They rode knee to knee in close formation, striking with precision and refusing to pursue plunder when victory was won. Their commander taught that courage and faith must stand in place of pride and fury. While Parliament prepared, the king's situation worsened. His armies were scattered and weary. The royalist treasury was nearly empty and supplies dwindled. Prince Rupert, though still brilliant, faced growing distrust from older courtiers. King Charles remained steadfast but isolated, his faith in divine right unbroken, even as his kingdom burned around him. In the spring of 1645, the king gathered his remaining strength. His field army, about 12,000 strong, was commanded by Rupert. He moved through the Midlands, besieging Section Leicester, which fell after a brutal assault in May. The news reached Parliament like a shock. Many feared that London itself might be the next target. Fairfax, newly appointed to command the new model, was ordered north to intercept the Royalists before they could strike again. The two armies moved through the heart of England, searching for advantage. Skirmishes flared in the hedged lanes and market towns. Both sides sought to draw the other into open battle. On Fawsty, June 13, 1645, scouts reported that Rupert had taken position near Naseby, a small village in Northamptonshire. Fairfax advanced at once. That night his soldiers preyed upon the moor, their watchfires flickering under the dark sky. They believed that the coming fight would decide the future of England. The dawn that followed brought the storm of Naseby. The new model army, still young but unified in discipline and purpose, met the Royalists in open field. Cromwell's horse stood steady against Rupert's charges. Fairfax led his infantry with unwavering calm. The battle raged for 2 hours, and when the smoke cleared, the king's army lay shattered. The victory at Naseby was not only military, but moral. Parliament soldiers captured the king's baggage train, including his private correspondence. Within it were letters revealing his secret appeals to foreign powers and Catholic allies. When these were published, they destroyed what remained of his credibility. Even those who had once doubted Parliament began to see the king as a man willing to endanger his own realm to save his throne. After Naseby, the Royalist cause spiraled into retreat. Fairfax's army marched from victory to victory, capturing towns and fortresses that had once flown the royal standard. Bristol, once thought impregnable, surrendered that autumn. Oxford, the king's capital, stood alone amid ruin. The war that had begun as a quarrel over rights and taxes had become something far greater. England had forged a new kind of army, and in doing so, had uncovered a new kind of power, one born not of royal command, but of faith, discipline, and a belief that men could shape their own destiny. The triumph of the new model army marked the beginning of the end for King Charles I, but it also opened a new and dangerous question. Who truly ruled England? The Parliament that raised the army, or the army itself? In the months after Naseby, the Royalist cause unravelled. The defeat had broken the king's main army, and his dream of regaining control of England began to fade. Yet Charles I refused to surrender. From the towers of Oxford, his court plotted desperate alliances, seeking help from Ireland, from the Scots, and from any prince in Europe who might still heed a plea from a shrinking throne. The war dragged through 1645 and into 1646. The new model army, now the most effective fighting force in the realm, moved methodically through the Royalist heartlands. Town after town fell to Fairfax and Cromwell. Bristol surrendered in September, its walls battered by parliamentarian guns. Devizes, Winchester and Basinghouse followed. The once great fortresses of the king's cause became smoking ruins. By the spring of 1646, only Oxford remained. The city had served as the king's refuge. Its colleges turned into arsenals and hospitals, its chapels echoing with the prayers of soldiers and courtiers. But even here, supplies were running out. Parliament's forces encircled the city, their siege lines tightening day by day. Within the walls, hunger and fear grew. On April 27, 1646, disguised in plain clothes, Charles slipped through the gates at night and rode north. He hoped to find refuge with the Scottish army stationed near Newark, believing that shared monarchy might earn him mercy. The Scots received him with courtesy but also calculation. Their own cause was strained, and the alliance with Parliament was uneasy. By May, Oxford surrendered to Fairfax, and the First Civil War was over. Yet peace did not follow. The victors now faced one another across a gulf of belief. Parliament wanted settlement under a constitutional monarchy. The Scots demanded the establishment of Presbyterianism across England. The new model army, unpaid and mistrusted, insisted on recognition and reform. At the centre of it all stood Charles, quiet, courteous, and unyielding. From his captivity, first under the Scots and later under Parliament, the king played a dangerous game. He sought to divide his enemies, to balance one faction against another. He negotiated with the Scots in secret, promising to impose Presbyterianism in England for 3 years if they would restore him to power. It was a fateful bargain. When the Scots learned that Parliament would not accept such terms, they decided to sell the king's custody to England for £200,000 in January 1647. The king was delivered to Parliament, but still he plotted. As debates raged between Parliament and the army, Charles watched and waited for his chance. The soldiers of the new model, angered by arrears of pay and suspicious of Parliament's intentions, grew restless. Petitions circulated through the ranks demanding justice and recognition. When Parliament ordered parts of the army to disband, the troops refused. Cromwell and Fairfax struggled to maintain order, yet they understood the mood of their men. In June 1647, a daring act changed everything. A young officer named Cornet George Joyce, acting with tacit approval from army leaders, rode to Holmby House, where the king was held, and seized him in the army's name. The king was brought to the soldiers' camp. Charles, sensing opportunity, treated his captors with charm and grace. He walked among them, spoke kindly, and offered promises of reconciliation. Some soldiers began to believe he might yet be restored as a king in agreement, but trust soon shattered. In November 1647, Charles escaped to the Isle of Wight, where he entered new negotiations with both Parliament and the Scots. These secret dealings became known as the Engagement, an agreement to support a Scottish invasion of England in return for his restoration. The result was the Second Civil War of 1648. Royalist risings broke out across England and Wales. A Scottish army crossed the border under the Duke of Hamilton. Yet the new model army, hardened by victory and conviction, crushed them all. Cromwell destroyed the Scots at Hangre Preston. In August 1648, a brutal running battle fought through rain and mud. When the news reached London, Parliament split. The majority still hoped to negotiate with the king. The army, furious and disillusioned, saw treachery in every offer of peace. Cromwell and the officers resolved that Charles must be held to account for the bloodshed in England. In December, troops under Colonel Thomas Pride surrounded the Houses of Parliament and barred those members who opposed the army's will. This, Pride's Purge, left behind a remnant known as the Prides, Rump Parliament, obedient and resolute. In January 1649, Charles was brought to trial in Westminster Hall. Never before had an English king been called to answer to his subjects. The hall was filled with soldiers, and outside, crowds gathered in silence. The king stood calm, refusing to recognize the court's authority. He argued that no man could lawfully sit in judgment over his sovereign. But the tide of history had turned. After days of proceedings, the court found Charles guilty of high treason. He was sentenced to death. On the morning of thus January 30th, 1649, he was led to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A black cloth hung between him and the crowd. The air was cold, the sky pale. He wore 2 shirts so that he would not shiver and seem afraid. At a single signal, the axe fell. A groan rose from the crowd, followed by a stunned silence. The head of Charles Stuart, King of England, was held aloft. For the first time in the nation's history, the monarchy had been overthrown by its own people. England was left without a king, without a settled order, and uncertain of what future might follow. But one thing was clear: the revolution that began in smoke and fear on the fields of Nottingham had reached its grim conclusion in the heart of London. The execution of King Charles I on January 30th, 1649, sent shockwaves through England and across Europe. Monarchs and courts everywhere were horrified. The idea that a divinely appointed ruler could be tried and beheaded by his own subjects seemed unthinkable. Yet in London, the act was carried out with grim precision, and the realm awoke the next day to find itself a kingdom without a king. The Parliament that remained, the so-called Rump, moved swiftly to redefine the state. The House of Lords was abolished. The monarchy was declared unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous. England was proclaimed a Commonwealth, a republic governed in the name of the people. Officially, sovereignty now rested not in a crown, but in Parliament and the representatives of the nation. In practice, however, power belonged to the army. The new model, victorious and disciplined, had no equal. Its officers believed that Providence had chosen them to preserve the godly reformation of England. They saw themselves not merely as soldiers, but as instruments of divine justice. Within their ranks burned the conviction that the war, the king's death, and the new order were all parts of a sacred design. Yet the peace that followed was uneasy. The execution of Charles had not ended the wars of the three kingdoms. Across the Irish Sea, the Confederate Catholics still controlled much of Ireland, while royalist commanders pledged to avenge their fallen king. In Scotland, the Covenanters, shocked by the regicide, turned against the English Parliament and proclaimed Charles's son the Pine Prince of Wales, as Cain Tim Charles II. The young man was exiled in Holland, but remained a potent symbol for loyalists across the Isles. The new Commonwealth faced enemies on all fronts. In the spring of 1649, Parliament ordered an expedition to Ireland to crush the Royalist Confederate alliance and secure English authority. The task fell to Oliver Cromwell, now Lord Lieutenant and the most powerful soldier in England. Cromwell set sail in August with 12,000 veterans of the new model army. They landed near Dublin, a city that had only recently been saved from capture. From the outset, Cromwell declared the campaign a mission of divine justice. Ireland, long viewed by English Protestants as a land of rebellion and popery, would feel the full weight of the Commonwealth's wrath. The first target was Drogheda, a fortified town north of Dublin. When its garrison refused to surrender, Cromwell ordered a full assault. The storming that followed became infamous. After the walls were breached, the defenders continued to fight from towers and churches. Cromwell commanded that no quarter be given. Nearly the entire garrison, some 3,000 men, was killed, along with many civilians caught in the chaos. From Drogheda, the army marched south to Wexford, another royalist stronghold. Once again, negotiations failed. Parliamentarian troops broke into the town before terms could be agreed, and another slaughter followed. Ships burned in the harbour, the streets filled with corpses, and the town was left in ruins. To Cromwell's mind, these acts were divine judgment, punishment for what he saw as decades of Irish rebellion and massacre. To his enemies, they were acts of terror. By the end of 1649, Ireland lay prostrate before the English advance. Town after town surrendered. The war continued under Cromwell's lieutenants, but his authority was secure. He returned to England in 1650 to face a new threat rising in the north. In Scotland, Charles II had landed and been crowned at Scone. The Scots, despite their old alliance with Parliament, now sought to restore monarchy under their own covenant. The young king was only 20, handsome and charismatic, but his cause was fragile. He relied on the discipline of Scottish Presbyterians and the loyalty of scattered English royalists. Cromwell marched north with the new model army, determined to destroy this final resistance. The campaign was grueling. The Scottish hills were cold and wet, the supplies scarce, and disease spread through the ranks. Yet Cromwell's confidence never wavered. In September 1650, he met the Scots near Dunbar. Outnumbered and trapped against the sea, the English seemed doomed. Then, at dawn on September 3rd, Cromwell struck. His men charged with ferocity, breaking the Scottish line and scattering their army. The victory at Dunbar opened the way to Edinburgh and crushed the covenanting dream of restoring monarchy under their terms. Charles II fled south the following year, gathering what men he could for a final gamble. His army crossed into England, marching through Worcester with the hope of rallying royalist sympathisers. But the countryside remained silent. Few rose to join him. On September 3rd, 1651, exactly 1 year after Dunbar, Cromwell's army surrounded Worcester. After a fierce day of fighting, Charles's forces were destroyed. The young king barely escaped, hiding for weeks in forests and farmhouses before fleeing to France. With Worcester's fall, the long wars were over. For the first time in its history, all of Britain and Ireland lay under a single authority, a republic born not from consensus, but from conquest. The Commonwealth now stretched across the islands, held together by force of arms and the unyielding will of its soldiers. Yet beneath the surface, questions began to stir. Could a nation forged in war govern itself in peace? Could faith and liberty survive the burden of power? And what would become of the army that had overthrown a king only to find itself the master of England? The Commonwealth that emerged after Worcester was a republic in name, but a military state in practice. Parliament ruled, yet its power rested on the pikes and muskets of the new model army. At its centre stood Oliver Cromwell, the soldier who had risen from minor gentry to the most powerful man in the kingdom. By 1652, Cromwell had subdued both Ireland and Scotland. The three kingdoms that once defied one another were now bound together under English authority. To his followers, he was a chosen instrument of providence. To his critics, he was a general who had replaced a king. The Commonwealth faced daunting challenges. The wars had devastated the economy. Trade was disrupted, towns lay in ruins, and taxation weighed heavily on the people. The Rump Parliament, which had governed since the king's death, seemed increasingly self-serving. Many of its members sought wealth and position rather than reform. The godly officers who had fought for a new and righteous England grew restless, believing that Parliament had betrayed its calling. Cromwell himself grew disillusioned. Though he had fought for liberty under law, he saw the Rump as corrupt and sluggish. On Sepsis, April 20th, 1653, he resolved to act. Marching into the chamber with soldiers at his back, he addressed the stunned members. Without raising his voice, he declared that they had failed the people and must go. When they hesitated, he struck the table with his hand and ordered them to leave. The mace, symbol of parliamentary authority, was seized. England's experiment in representative government ended in silence. In place of the Rump, Cromwell and his council called a new assembly of godly men. It became known as the Barebones Parliament, after one of its more colourful members, Praise God Barebone, a London leather seller and zealous Puritan. The assembly tried to draft sweeping reforms, abolishing tithes, reforming the legal system and restructuring the church, but its members quarrelled endlessly. By the end of the year, weary of chaos, they dissolved themselves and handed power back to Cromwell. On December 16th, 1653, a new constitution, the instrument of government, was proclaimed. It named Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He accepted the office reluctantly, at least in appearance, kneeling to take the oath beneath the painted ceiling of Westminster Hall. The protectorate that followed sought to blend authority with reform. Cromwell ruled with the help of a Council of State and a single-chamber parliament, but ultimate control remained with him and the army. His government maintained strict order. Local militias, called the 8 Major Generals, were appointed to enforce morality and security. They suppressed gambling, drunkenness, and theatre. Sunday was guarded as a day of rest. Public festivals gave way to days of fasting and prayer. Yet Cromwell was not merely a tyrant cloaked in piety. He was driven by vision and faith. He allowed Jews to return to England after centuries of expulsion, believing tolerance preferable to persecution. He encouraged learning, trade, and the building of a navy that soon challenged Dutch power at sea. Under his rule, England's influence extended across the Atlantic to colonies in the Caribbean and North America. Still, beneath the order lay unease. The nation had grown weary of military rule. Taxes to support the standing army remained high. Many longed for the old stability of monarchy. Royalists plotted in exile, and pamphlets circulated in secret, portraying Cromwell as a usurper who wore the crown in all but name. In 1657, Parliament offered him that very crown. They proposed to restore kingship, believing it might bring legitimacy and end the divisions of the past decade. For weeks, Cromwell considered the offer. He prayed, consulted his officers, and weighed the burden of conscience. In the end, he refused. He would not wear a crown that so many had died to cast down. Instead, he accepted a second term as Lord Protector under a revised constitution. The following year brought both triumph and grief. England's navy captured Jamaica from Spain, securing a new foothold in the New World. But Cromwell's health began to fail. The years of war and sleepless labour had worn him down. His eldest son, Richard, lacked his father's strength and insight, yet the machinery of state continued to revolve around the Protector's will. In his final months, Cromwell's thoughts turned inward. He spoke of God's providence, of England's destiny, and of the heavy cost of peace. On September 3rd, 1658, the anniversary of his victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell died at Whitehall. Outside, a storm raged across the city. Many said it was the heavens mourning their chosen servant. He was buried with royal honours in Westminster Abbey, his coffin draped in velvet and guarded by soldiers. For a moment, it seemed the Commonwealth might endure. But without Cromwell's hand, the balance of power would falter. Within 2 years, the dream of a godly republic would dissolve, and England would once again look to its exiled kings. When Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658, the Commonwealth he had built began to crumble. His son, Richard Cromwell, inherited the title of Lord Protector, but not the strength or authority of his father. The army respected Oliver's iron will, not his bloodline. Richard, mild and uncertain, lacked the command to keep generals and politicians in line. The peace Cromwell had held together through discipline and faith now began to unravel. The officers of the new model army, restless and divided, argued over pay, power, and purpose. The Puritan order that had ruled the country seemed increasingly hollow. Churches stood half empty. The people, once awed by godly zeal, now longed for familiar rhythms of life. The ringing of church bells, the reopening of taverns and theatres, the comfort of old customs. Parliament, revived under the Protectorate's framework, began to turn against military control. The officers, in turn, forced Richard to dissolve it. England teetered once again on the edge of chaos. The republic that had executed a king was now adrift without a leader. In this uncertainty, one man saw opportunity. General George Monk, commander of the English forces in Scotland, was a cautious, pragmatic soldier. He had served both king and Commonwealth, and his loyalty was to order above ideology. In the winter of 1659, as quarrels consumed London, Monk marched his army south. His intent was clear: to restore stability, whatever form it might take. By February 1660, Monk entered the capital. The streets of London filled with cheering crowds. Soldiers stood uncertain, but did not resist. He recalled the Long Parliament that had been dismissed a decade earlier and urged its members to call new elections. The message was unmistakable. England would decide its own future through a free parliament. In April, the newly elected Convention Parliament met at Westminster. Across the Channel, in exile at Breda, Charles Stuart, son of the executed king, issued a declaration. The Declaration of Breda promised pardon for past offences, religious toleration, and respect for property and Parliament. It was a careful gesture of reconciliation. The mood in England had changed. The people were weary of soldiers, decrees, and sermons. They wanted peace, prosperity, and the return of lawful government. When Parliament invited Charles to return as king, the nation welcomed the decision with relief rather than fear. On Nassi. May 29, 1660. Charles II rode into London amid ringing bells and roaring crowds. Flowers were strewn before him. The capital, which had once watched his father led to the scaffold, now erupted in celebration. Bonfires blazed, taverns overflowed, and music filled the streets. For the first time in nearly 20 years, England had a crowned monarch. The Restoration was both an end and a beginning. The monarchy was re-established, but it was no longer the same institution that had fallen in 1649. Parliament's role in governance was now undeniable. The memory of war and regicide hung over the throne. Charles II, clever and worldly, understood that survival required compromise. He quickly moved to balance forgiveness with caution. The Act of Indemnity and Oblivion pardoned most of those who had fought against his father, declaring a general amnesty, except for such as had an immediate hand in that horrid murder. The regicides, the judges who had signed the death warrant of Charles I, were hunted down. Some fled abroad, others were captured and executed. Oliver Cromwell's corpse was exhumed from Westminster Abbey, hanged in chains, and cast into a pit, a symbolic punishment for a man already beyond reach. Yet beneath the pageantry, deep divisions remained. The Puritan clergy, who had guided the nation during the Commonwealth, were driven from their pulpits. The Church of England was restored, its bishops reinstated, its liturgy renewed. Religious nonconformists, Presbyterians, Independents, Baptists and Quakers, found themselves again on the margins, fined and imprisoned for their dissent. The freedom for which many had fought was slowly withdrawn in favour of uniformity and control. Still, the Restoration brought a measure of stability. Trade revived, ships once again filled the Thames, and London thrived as the heart of a global empire beginning to stir. The theatres reopened, their stages alive with wit and laughter. Court life returned in a blaze of colour and indulgence. Charles II, called the Merry Monarch, surrounded himself with poets, philosophers, and mistresses. His court reflected a nation eager to forget its years of austerity. Yet the old questions remained unanswered. The balance between Crown and Parliament, between authority and liberty, had shifted but not settled. The fires that had burned in the 1640s smouldered still beneath the surface, ready to flare again in another century. For now, England rested. The soldiers of the new model faded into memory, their graves scattered from Ireland to Worcester. The scarlet banners of For God and Parliament were folded and stored, their slogans now echoes in history. The nation that had executed its king and then restored his son had been changed forever. The monarchy returned, but the idea that power might belong to the people had taken root. The struggle between conscience and command, faith and freedom, would define the English spirit long after the smoke of civil war had cleared. The guns had fallen silent, the banners were furled, and the monarchy restored. But the English civil wars left scars that would never fade. Between 1642 and 1651, nearly 200,000 people across England, Scotland, and Ireland had perished, soldiers and civilians alike, killed in battle, by plague, or by famine born of war. Entire regions were devastated. Fields lay untilled, towns were ruined, and families that had once shared pews now carried hatred across generations. The wars had begun as a struggle over royal authority, but had evolved into something far greater. They had shattered the unquestioned bond between ruler and subject, between church and nation. Never again could a king rule England solely by divine right. The beheading of Charles I, once seen as unthinkable, had shown that even a monarch could be held accountable by his people. The sword had made a new principle possible, that power, however sacred, could be judged by law and conscience. The social landscape of England was transformed. The gentry, those country families who had filled both armies, emerged dominant, their lands intact and their political power strengthened. But new voices had also risen from the ranks of common men. In the new model army, soldiers had debated ideas of government and liberty that would echo through centuries to come. In 1647, during the fall, Putney debates, ordinary soldiers and officers had spoken of voting rights, freedom of conscience, and equality before the law. Their words had been radical, even dangerous, but they revealed a new consciousness awakening in England. The Levellers. as they were called, believed that government should rest on the consent of the governed. Though their movement was suppressed, their ideals endured, whispering through the future like a promise yet unfulfilled. The war also changed religion. Before 1642, England had one church and one official faith. After the turmoil, that unity could never fully return. The Restoration reimposed the Anglican Church, but diversity of worship had already taken root. Independent congregations, Baptists, Quakers, and countless smaller sects survived in defiance of persecution. The belief that a man might worship according to his own conscience, once a treasonous thought, had become part of the national soul. In Ireland, the consequences were even more profound. Cromwell's campaigns had crushed rebellion, but left bitterness that would last for centuries. Land confiscations displaced entire populations. Irish Catholics lost vast estates to English Protestant settlers. The divisions of faith and land, sharpened by blood and conquest, set the stage for generations of conflict. Scotland, too, was transformed. The dream of a Presbyterian kingdom under divine covenant had ended at Dunbar and Worcester. Yet the Scottish Kirk endured, fierce and independent, preserving its faith in the face of English domination. The union of the crowns, once seen as a guarantee of peace, had instead revealed the deep differences among the three kingdoms that shared one monarch. Culturally, the war reshaped the English imagination. The poets, preachers, and chroniclers of the age wrote of judgment, providence, and the cost of sin. Sermons thundered of divine punishment. Pamphlets debated the meaning of freedom. The printing press, unshackled by censorship during the chaos, poured forth thousands of works, political manifestos, religious tracts, and personal diaries. Ideas once confined to scholars and courtiers now reached artisans and soldiers. A new public sphere was born, the forerunner of modern opinion and political discourse. The conflict also forged a new military identity. The new model army, though disbanded after the Restoration, had set a precedent for a professional standing army loyal to the state rather than to feudal lords. Its organization, discipline, and training influenced armies across Europe. Yet its presence during the Commonwealth had also left England wary of soldiers wielding political power. The fear of military rule would haunt the country for generations. On the world stage, England emerged stronger. The Commonwealth's navy, built under Cromwell, became the foundation of maritime empire. The wars had taught England to think not only as a kingdom, but as a nation-state, capable of projecting power far beyond its shores. Within a few decades, that navy would carry English merchants, settlers, and soldiers to the coasts of Africa, America, and Asia. Yet amid the achievements and progress, the memory of fratricidal war endured. Churches still bore the marks of cannon shot. In village churchyards, weathered stones recorded sons lost in the wars between king and parliament. Ballads told of battles fought in mist and rain, of neighbours turned enemies. The moral lessons of those years became woven into the national character. Suspicion of tyranny, reverence for conscience, and a deep belief in the limits of power. By the end of the 17th century, England would once again face questions of monarchy and freedom during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But it would not fall into civil war again. The lessons learned in blood between 1642 and 1651 had reshaped the political world. The idea of constitutional monarchy, government by consent, and religious toleration all traced their origins to those storm years of rebellion and faith. From the silence of the battlefields to the debates in Parliament, the civil wars had turned England from a feudal kingdom into a modern nation. They had proved that even in the smallest island realm, the struggle between authority and liberty could change the course of history. The smoke of Naseby, the prayers of Cromwell's soldiers, and the cry of "For God and Parliament" still lingered in the imagination of generations to come. The nation that had been divided by belief would, through pain and endurance, find a new identity, restless, questioning, and free. The English Civil War was not merely a contest of power between monarch and parliament. It was a struggle of conscience, a battle for the soul of a nation uncertain of its faith and fearful of its destiny. Beneath the roar of muskets and the clash of steel lay questions that could not be answered by force. What did it mean to obey, to believe, to be free? The war had begun in the language of loyalty and obedience. King Charles I then saw himself as a shepherd chosen by God, ordained to rule in righteousness. His subjects were to follow him as they followed divine order. Yet his people, schooled by the Reformation and guided by Scripture, had learned another lesson, that obedience to God might sometimes require resistance to kings. When Parliament took up arms, its leaders claimed not rebellion, but duty. They fought, they said, to preserve the true ancient liberties of England and the purity of religion. Across the country, sermons became as powerful as swords. Ministers stood before their congregations and declared that the conflict was a test of the nation's faith. On the royalist side, preachers urged submission to God's appointed ruler. On the parliamentarian side, Puritan voices thundered of a covenant with the Almighty, of a godly people chosen to purge the land of corruption. Soldiers marched to battle beneath banners embroidered with Scripture. The Lord of Hosts became their watchword, their musket smoke a kind of prayer. The war thus became a sacred enterprise in the minds of many. Yet sacred war always carries its contradictions. When men believe they fight for heaven, mercy is easily lost. At Drogheda, at Wexford, at countless smaller sieges, the fury of the faithful left towns in ashes. Captains who prayed before battle could kill without hesitation after it, convinced that divine justice demanded blood. But conscience was not only a weapon, it was also a burden. Many who had once shouted for God and Parliament found themselves haunted by doubt as the years dragged on. The lines between right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, grew blurred. Cromwell himself wrestled endlessly with his conscience, convinced that God's hand guided his victories, yet fearful of the pride that victory might bring. When he signed the death warrant of Charles I, he later told his confessor that he did so only after fasting and prayer. It was not ambition, he insisted, but obedience to providence. In every church and household, the war forced men and women to choose sides, not only in politics, but in spirit. The Puritans believed England must be cleansed of idolatry and sin. They closed theatres, smashed stained glass, and silenced music in cathedrals. To them, joy itself was a temptation of the flesh. Yet in their zeal, they also discovered the power of individual conscience, the right of every soul to stand before God without priest or monarch as mediator. Out of their austerity would grow the seeds of religious freedom. For the ordinary people, the war was both distant and near. Villages endured requisition and plunder from both armies. Sons were taken to fight. Fathers returned wounded, or not at all. Women became keepers of families, managers of farms, healers in makeshift hospitals. They too prayed for deliverance, but their prayers were for bread, peace, and the safe return of those they loved. When the guns fell silent, England was weary of zeal. The Restoration brought back laughter, music, and colour, yet even amid its revelry, the questions of conscience endured. Could a nation that had killed its king ever believe in divine right again? Could the Church ever command the same unity of faith? The answer, quietly, was no. The wars had taught England that belief, like government, must rest on choice, not compulsion. In the decades that followed, dissenters worshipped in barns and secret chapels. They risked prison for their faith, but would not recant. These small congregations, Quakers, Baptists, Independents, became the living legacy of a nation that had fought to obey its conscience. They were persecuted, but their endurance gave England something more lasting than victory, the principle that no earthly power may rule the soul. From this crucible of conflict emerged the foundation of modern liberty. The right to petition, to debate, to challenge authority, all were strengthened by the memory of the war. The English learned that truth was not the possession of kings or parliaments, but something discovered through struggle, prayer, and reason. In the end, the war's greatest legacy was not on the battlefield, but in the heart. It taught that faith and freedom are inseparable, that conscience, once awakened, can never again be silenced. The scars it left upon the land were deep, but in those scars lay the birth of something enduring, the English soul itself, restless, skeptical, devout, and forever seeking balance between order and liberty. When the last muskets fell silent and the monarchy was restored, England stood changed beyond recognition. The landscape of power, faith, and identity had been remade. The civil wars, though ended, lingered in memory as a haunting echo, an unspoken warning of what happens when a nation turns upon itself. For years after the Restoration, silence covered the land. Few wished to speak of the rebellion that had cut a king's head from his shoulders. Veterans returned home, hiding their scars behind the rhythms of ordinary life. Former Roundheads and Cavaliers shared the same taverns, their loyalty whispered only in trusted company. In parish churches, the names of the fallen were read without mention of which side they had fought for. The country sought to forget, yet the war's shadow stretched over every field and every conscience. The war had begun in the name of principle, but it had taught England the price of absolutism, whether royal or revolutionary. The divine right of kings had died with Charles I, and though the crown returned, it was forever diminished. Parliament had discovered its strength. No monarch would again rule without it. The people, too, had tasted power. They had seen that kings could fall, that laws could be rewritten, and that faith could justify both mercy and murder. The balance between ruler and ruled would never be the same. Beneath this new balance, the legacy of the civil wars shaped the centuries to come. Out of its turmoil came the belief that government should rest upon consent, not coercion. The notion that conscience was sacred, that no man could be forced to worship against his will, became the cornerstone of English liberty. Though imperfectly applied, these ideas survived, carried forward by dissenters and reformers who remembered the price paid for freedom. Cromwell's new model army had shown what disciplined conviction could achieve, yet its rule also revealed the danger of power unbound by accountability. The English learned to fear not only the tyranny of kings, but the tyranny of armies and zeal. The lesson endured, that liberty and order must walk together, or both will perish. The wars also transformed the imagination of the people. Writers, preachers, and philosophers sought to understand what had happened. John Milton, who had defended the Republic in his prose, later wrote of lost paradise and the fall of man, reflecting the moral turmoil of a nation that had risen against its own sovereign. Thomas Hobbes, exiled during the conflict, wrote Leviathan, arguing that only strong authority could prevent chaos. In their words, the intellectual soul of England wrestled with the meaning of freedom, obedience, and sin. Even nature seemed to bear the memory. In the countryside, abandoned manor houses stood as silent monuments to divided families. Cannonballs were found in church walls, pike heads buried in orchards. Local lore kept alive tales of battles fought on misty heaths and of ghostly soldiers marching at night. The civil wars were not only written in history books, they lived in the landscape and in the whispered memories of every generation that followed. Yet from this devastation grew endurance. The wars forged a people skeptical of power, resilient in adversity, and conscious of their rights. When, decades later, England faced another crisis during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, it did not erupt into another war. Instead, it changed kings peacefully, guided by law and reason rather than blood. That restraint was born from the memory of the 1640s, when too much zeal had drowned reason in smoke and ruin. The influence of the civil wars reached far beyond Britain's shores. In the following centuries, their ideals would echo in the political revolutions of Europe and America. The notion that rulers could be held to account by the governed, that liberty was the natural right of mankind, found its first fierce expression on English soil. The shadow of Naseby and Westminster stretched across the Atlantic, shaping the world's future in ways unseen by those who fought beneath its banners. And yet, for all its consequence, the war remains deeply human. It was a conflict fought in mud and fear, by men who prayed before battle and fell beneath banners embroidered with scripture. It was fought by fathers and sons who loved their God and their country, yet found themselves enemies. The cries of "for the King" and "for God and Parliament" have long faded, but the longing behind them, to find justice, order and meaning, endures in every age. The English Civil War was not the end of an old world, nor merely the beginning of a new one. It was the moment when a people looked into the mirror of their own beliefs and saw both their nobility and their cruelty reflected back. It was a revolution of conscience, a test of faith, and the birth of modern England. As the centuries passed, the echoes of musket fire softened into memory, and the green fields once stained with blood grew quiet again. Yet under that calm soil lie the bones of those who fought for what they believed to be right. Their sacrifice endures not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a warning and a legacy, the reminder that liberty, once awakened, can never again be silenced. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.